Okay, it's 11 o'clock, and we're starting with Blazor Azure B2C Authentication and Authorization. I'm Michael Washington. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I've written a couple of books on Blazor. The most recent books you can get for free if you go to syncfusion.com. And I actually have a new book that should be coming out on syncfusion.com with Azure Maps. Hopefully that'll be coming out in the next 2 months. Okay, so here's the agenda of what we're going to be covering. First, we're going to cover what is Azure B2C, and we'll also cover why would you want to use Azure B2C. We'll then cover all the steps you need to register an application with Azure B2C and create our first user flow. Then what we're going to do is we're going to cover all the steps to create a Blazor Server App that will connect to the Azure B2C application that we're going to set up. And this is also new. If you've captured my last, if you attended my last presentation, this time we'll also be covering all the steps you need to make it work with Blazor WebAssembly. We're going to cover a couple of the steps on how to create custom policies. And custom policies are where you can really make Azure B2C do whatever you need it to do. And we'll kind of cover all the steps that you need to implement the custom policies. We won't go deep into a custom policy because that would take the entire 2-hour presentation. This presentation is only going to be an hour, but it would take about 2 hours to go through how to create custom policies. But we'll cover what it takes to create a custom policy and how you implement it. We'll then finish up the presentation showing you how to manage your users from your Blazor C# application, how to manage those users in your Azure B2C tenant. So we'll be covering how to detect if someone's in a group, how to put them in groups, how to take them out of groups, how to even, do deletions and that sort of thing. Finally, the last slides, I'll have links to all the source code that I'll be covering. And also, I'll have links to all the blog posts that this presentation is actually a culmination of about 6 different blog posts. So I'll have links to everything, and that'll be at the end. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. First off, what is Azure B2C? So looking at a normal application flow, starting from reading from left to right, you have your web application. The person clicks the login button. A login screen pops up, and they type in their username and password, or they say, I want to add an account, and all their information is stored in the application's database. With Azure B2C, the flow is a little bit different. Again, starting reading from left to right, you have the application, the person clicks the login button. However, they're now presented with the option of authenticating against one or more social identity providers. They can also, of course, still log directly into and create an account directly in your Azure B2C tenant, but mostly people use Azure B2C because they want to implement, social identity providers. So when they log in or create an account, their account is now stored in the Azure B2C tenant. In addition, and then they're directed into the application. In addition, the application can also store information in the application database, and I will cover the steps on how to do that. The reason why people want to use Azure B2C is it's very extensible, and Microsoft describes it as a custom branded identity solution. So for example, instead of generic login screens, you can make a login screen that looks like this. Now to do this, it would take using custom policies. Setting that up is what I'll be covering, but this just shows you what's possible. Again, Microsoft says that Azure B2C is a single sign-on access with user-provided identity. So on the left-hand side here, it's showing you how you can tie into most of the social platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and of course Google, or actually any SAML provider, including your own custom ones. And then, of course, you have the Azure B2C tenant in the middle. And on the right-hand side, you have your application. So you have your web apps, you have your mobile apps. You can even have web APIs. And the protocol can be OAuth or OIDC. It also integrates with external user stores. So here it's showing you, reading from left to right, the person logs in using, again, any social identity provider. They're logging into the various apps you have. Um, the user is stored in the Azure B2C tenant. However, only the GUID for the user and their password can be stored in the Azure B2C tenant. All other information can be stored on premises. So sometimes people need that for compliance, that has to be stored on-prem. So Azure B2C actually works with that. Again, this does require custom policies to implement. There's a ton of features that Azure B2C offers. However, one of the nice ones is progressive profiling. So again, reading from left to right, the person signs up. All they have to provide is, for example, say you're going to ask for their email and their phone number. The next time they sign in, you can say, oh, we also want to know your birth date if you want to provide that. The next time they sign in, you can ask them for their favorite color. Again, all this is completely customizable by you. What you gather, again, is totally customizable. And this entire flow is, again, completely customizable by you using custom policies. Another really great thing about Azure B2C is security. So here you can have third-party identification, validation. So starting up in the upper left-hand corner, the person logs in, and they'll say what they want to create an account. So let's say you want to make sure that people aren't creating a bunch of spam accounts. You can actually, again, using custom policies in your flow, pass it off to some third-party identity spoofing, which can take in the information and create a digital risk score. And based upon that, you can deny that account from being created. You can also, of course, use this flow when a person is authenticating into the app to block, a bunch of password spray attacks and that sort of thing. So how do you get started with Azure B2C? Here's your steps. You basically go to portal.azure.com, create an Azure account if you don't already have one. Otherwise, sign in with your existing account. You click Create a Resource, and you search for Azure Active Directory B2C. It'll show up. You click Create. Now, before we click Create, you're going to ask, how much does this cost? For 50,000 users or less, it's totally free. And for more users than that, the cost is like 0.0001 cents based upon what plan that you have. So it is very, very cost effective. You'll want to check the actual the most recent pricing. However, the last time I checked, for 50,000 users, it's totally free. So unless you're expecting more than 50,000 users, everything I'm describing here would be free for you. So you click the button to say create a new Azure B2C tenant. You give your organization a unique name. You have to pick a domain name that's unique, and you click review and create, and it's been created. In order to find it, you can go to all resources, search for the name that you created, click on it. This will take you to the object, not the actual tenant. So I have this big arrow here showing you that to get into your Azure B2C tenant, you have to click on that link, and then you'll see that the screen will refresh and it'll take you actually into the tenant. So once you've created your Azure B2C tenant, the first step is to register an application. So to do that, you click on App Registrations, click New Registration. You give it a name. So note that for this example here, we're going to call this Blazor Azure B2C. Later, when we set up Azure B2C for Blazor WebAssembly, we're going to end up creating two applications. But in this case, we're only going to create one. And it's just been created. So now we want to make a user flow. And the user flow is basically describing the steps of how does a person go about creating a new account if they haven't logged in before, or what does it look like when they do log in, and what social identity providers or options are going to be available to the person. So that's what we're going to do to create a user flow. So we go to identity providers. So the user flow example that we're going to use is to allow a person to log in with a Microsoft account. So we have to do this one-time setup where we go to identity providers, select Microsoft account, and fill in the values and click save. You'll notice here that it's asking for a client secret. So we would actually have to add a client secret to the app registration that we did in the previous step. However, there's a link, learn more about configuring the providers, that will walk you through the steps. But this is a one-time thing where we set up the Microsoft account. And then now we go to user flows and click new user flow. And at this point, we can just select one of their pre-made templates, which is what I would recommend. So we're going to select the sign up and sign in template. So it'll cover creating a flow for people signing up for the first time or signing in to an existing account. The version, we'll just go with the recommended. And we need to give it a name. So note, the name that we're giving this one is Blazor Sign In, Sign Up. That's important because this name, B2C _1 _ Blazor Sign In, Sign Up, is what we're going to put into our Blazor application to indicate that this flow that we're about to create is the one that is to be triggered when a person clicks the login button in the Blazor application. Again, you can allow people to not use a social identity provider. They can sign directly into the Azure B2C tenant. That would be called a local account. For this example, we're going to say no, so we're going to say none. And for social identity provider, we're going to select Microsoft account. For multi-factor authentication, we're going to have an email sent for the verification. Again, I will show you all the steps on how that works. As far as enforcing MFA, multi-factor authentication, we're going to turn that off. Now for the attributes, which are gathered and then returned to our application, we're going to click the show more. And these are the settings that you'll want to select if you want the sample code to work. So it just shows what's collected and what's returned to the application. And then you click create, and the flow has been created. In order to get back to the flow, if we click on user flows, we'll see it'll show up on the right-hand side there. And if we click on it, we can go in and we can actually make edits to the flow. So now we're ready to create a Blazor application that will work with our Azure B2C tenant and the flow that we just created. So we'll open up Visual Studio. We'll select Create New Project. We'll select Blazor Server App. Again, later on, I'll show you how to do a Blazor WebAssembly app. We'll give it a name, Blazor Azure B2C. And this next step is important because we're going to indicate that we want the authentication type to be the Microsoft Identity Platform. Then when we click Create, a box is going to pop up saying it needs to configure some additional components. We click Finish, and it's done. So let's go ahead and take a quick look and see what that looks like. So we open up Visual Studio. We selected Create New Project. We selected Blazor Server App and went ahead and click Next. Go ahead and give it a name. We click Next. Authentication type. Make sure we select the Microsoft Identity Platform and go ahead and click Create. It'll create the project. A box will pop up indicating that it needs to add some additional components. We click Finish. Does a little bit of thinking, and our application is done. And there we go. Okay. So now that we have the application created, we now need to tie it into the Azure B2C tenant. So one of the first steps is we need to set the redirect URI. The reason why this is important is after a person clicks the login button into the application, they're directed to the Azure B2C tenant. The Azure B2C tenant will, of course, authenticate them. And once they have been authenticated, they'll be passed back to the application. They will only pass the person back to a URL that has been registered. So we need to add this URL registration to the application in Azure B2C that we created. So we'll just quickly walk through the steps. So to get the URL of the application, we go into the properties folder and we go into the launch settings JSON file. And when we open it up in the profile section under application URL, we will see actually two, one with HTTPS, one without. You always want to use the HTTPS version, so we're going to go ahead and copy that. We'll then return to our Azure B2C registration. So we can go app registrations and you search for the one we created earlier and select it. And then in the redirect URI section, we click the button to add a redirect URI. We click add platform and we select web. Make a note, when we do the Blazor WebAssembly setup, we'll actually be selecting the other option, which is single page application. But for a Blazor Server App, you would select web. And then we would add the redirect URI, which also known as the URL. And so this is what we kind of copied from the app. So we're going to add a /signin OIDC to the end of this. Then we'll go back into the app settings JSON file of the application, and we're going to add this entire section here we're going to replace everything with this. And the reason why we're doing that is we're creating a section, the Azure AD section, and we're going to set these properties because the application will need these properties. So everything that's in yellow is what you need to replace for your situation. So I'll show you how to get those values. So the first one is getting the Azure B2C domain name. In your Azure B2C tenant, on the overview page, you'll see the domain name right there. The next one we need is the client ID. So if we go to app registrations, we go to the registration we created, you'll see that's where the client ID is. The next value we need is a sign-up policy, which is that user flow that we created. So if you go to user flows, you'll see that name. And if you remember, B2C _1 _ Blazor sign up, Blazor sign in, sign up. So you put all those values in there. So now we're ready to log into Azure B2C from the application. So we can hit F5 to start debugging, and we'll be presented with an option of signing up with Microsoft. We'll sign in with the Microsoft account. And when we click next, we'll be presented with a box like this. So what it's asking for is a name and an email address, because remember, we set email for multi-factor authentication. So we'll fill in a name, our email, we'll send verification code, and then when we check our email, we'll see a code has been sent. So we copy that code and we go ahead and paste it back into the box and we click verify. After it's verified, we'll be able to put our first name and our last name, click continue, and then we're logged in. Again, if you look at this box and you say, I really don't like how that box looks, you can totally customize this box, or you can make it so it's multiple steps, so it's not just one big box. What's gathered, how the verification is done, all that you can customize. So I'm just showing you the quick, dirty default version. So again, you're logged in, but let's go ahead and take a look and see what that looks like. Okay, so again, we've logged in, we put our username and email, we click verification code. Now, if we go ahead and switch to our email, we'll see that email was sent from Microsoft. So they actually set up all the email stuff, the configuration for you. There's a code that we can then copy. We go ahead and paste in that code and click the verify code button. And then after it's been verified, we can then put our preferred username, first and last name. We click continue, and we're then logged into the application. Now, this, of course, is for signing up for the first time. The next time we're just logging into an existing account, it would just log us in. Okay, so we're now going to cover what are the steps you would make if you're creating a Blazor WebAssembly app. So in this case, we have to create two registrations. So we're going to create two new registrations. So we go to App Registrations, click New Registration, and the first registration that we're going to create, if you see the number 1 there, is we're going to create the Blazor Server AD B2C registration, because a Blazor WebAssembly app has actually 3 projects, including a shared project, but 2 main projects, which is a server app, the code that runs on the server, and a client app, which is code that actually runs in the person's web browser. So this is a registration for the server app. So we click Register. Now, what happens is that these 2 registrations that we're going to create need to trust each other. So the server app is going to expose an API, and then the client registration that we create next will then connect to that API. So we first click Expose an API, and we then going to add a scope. So we click Add Scope. Now, that long GUID, you see that B9169, that's created for you automatically. It's just a GUID, random GUID that's created. So you just click Save and Continue. But now we're going to create a scope. And the scope we're going to create is going to be called API.access. So we give the scope name, the number 1, number 2, we just describes what it is. Well, something that's displayed to the admin if they are configuring the scope to trust the scope. There's also a description we put for number 3. Number 4, we say it's enabled. And number 5, we add the scope. So we've added a scope to the server registration. Now we're going to create a client registration. So we'll go back to App Registrations. We click New Registration. This time the name is going to be Blazor Client AAD B2C. And now we're going to add a permission to basically connect to that scope. So we go to the API permission section, we click Add a permission. We then go to My APIs, and then we'll see that scope that we actually the API that we created earlier with the Blazor Server registration. If we select that, it'll then show us the scopes. There's only one scope that we created, the API.access. We select that scope and we say Add permissions. And then as the final step, you have to click a button to say grant admin consent for our tenant, which is our Azure B2C tenant, to use that scope. So now we've created 2 Azure B2C app registrations, and they're basically connected, whereas the client registration has an API permission to the scope that's exposed by the server registration. So at this point, we now say create the Blazor Azure B2C application. So we say create new project. This time we select Blazor WebAssembly App, give it a name, still click Microsoft Identity Platform. We click create, click finish when it wants to add the new components, and the application's been created. Now we still need to do that redirect URI. So this time it's in the client project. You go to launch settings, and we grab the application URL, make sure it's the HTTPS version. We then go into app registrations, and this time make sure we go into the client app registration, and we click add redirect URI. We click add a platform, but this time instead of selecting web, we select single page application, and we go ahead and paste in that URI that we copied, but this time we put a /authentication /login hyphen callback at the end. Also, under implicit grant and hybrid flows, you make sure that these 2 are actually not checked. So now we have to gather some values, kind of like we did with the server app, but we have to add values to both the client project and the server project. So again, to get the domain name, it's where it was for the server project. Tenant name, tenant domain, you also now have to gather, and I show you the location there. The client app client ID. So remember, we have 2 apps here. So for the client app client ID, that's where you would get it. For the server client app ID, that's where you would get it. And for the server app ID URI, this is where you would gather it. And for the default scope, this is where you would gather it. In this case, it was at API.access. And finally, the sign up or sign in policy, we're actually going to just reuse we're going to just use the user flow that we created for the Blazor Server App. So the user flow will actually work for both. So we're just going to grab that existing one. So now we have to update some settings in the Blazor WebAssembly application. So in the client project, we're going to update the program.cs file, and we're also going to update the app settings.json file in the www root folder in the client project. And in the server project, we're just going to update the app settings.json file like we did with the Blazor Server App. So in the client project, we're going to open up the program.cs file, and you'll see some code that looks like this, and you want to change it so that it follows this format. So in my example, this was my domain, and this was my default scope. And in the app settings.json file, you're going to see code that looks like this. So you want to replace it using this format. So in my case, this is my domain. This was my tenant domain. This was my sign up, sign in policy. And this was my client ID. And then finally, in the server project, we open up the app settings. And this one is pretty much like what we had for the Blazor Server App. However, the difference here is that there's a section for the scope. So the settings are pretty much the same as they were for the Blazor Server App, but the difference is that we'll be adding this section for scope. And then it just works. Okay, so I just want to have a couple of slides covering custom policies. First, what is the difference between a user flow, which is what we've demonstrated so far, and a custom policy? So this slide is kind of big, but the thing that you want to pay attention to is this section here. This is really what the difference is. So you have user flows in this column, and then you have custom policies in this column. But the real difference is down here, and some of the big things that it does is you can actually provision an account in another system. You can actually send customized welcome emails. You can actually store user information outside of Azure B2C. And you, of course, can have advanced validation against external systems, as well as progressive profiling and all sorts of things like that. So to use custom policies, you would click on the Identity Experience Framework section. There's a one-time setup that you would have to do where you have to create your signing keys and encryption keys, and also a one-time setup where you would register an Identity Experience Framework application and a Proxy Identity Experience Framework application. Again, their help docs will walk you through the steps, but it's pretty much like the app registrations where you just kind of go click, 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 and they're created. Now, to create your first custom policy, you're definitely going to want to download the starter pack. So we have the address here. And what's in the starter pack is 3 files, a relaying policy file, an extensions file, and a base file. All 3 of these files build upon each other. So the relaying policy file inherits things from the extensions file, which inherits things from the base file. When a person logs in, we're always targeting the relaying party file, and that's the one that indicates whether or not we're going to allow Google logins, Microsoft logins, Twitter logins, or multi-tenant Azure Active Directory logins. That's all triggered by the relaying policy file. Another way to look at this on the left-hand side, again, your base file is usually named trust framework base.xml. So it has base configurations. The extensions file, trust framework extensions XML, inherits everything from the base file, but adds additional configuration, things like, well, when they're going to Twitter, these options are available, and this is how the flow goes. And then you have the relaying policy file. In this case, this is where we have our unique name, either sign up or sign in, AADC or something like that. And this is just pretty much the thing that says, okay, these are the various providers that are going to be available. So now we're going back to Blazor Server App. In the app settings.json file, if you look on the right-hand side where we set up, specify the sign up, sign in policy, with our user flow, we just put the name of the user flow there. But in this case, we're going to put in what we would have for the policy ID in our relaying policy file. And that's how Azure B2C will know to trigger this custom flow. So I have an application. It's on GitHub. It's also live on the internet, called Blazor Simple Survey. And Blazor Simple Survey allows you to log in using an Azure Active Directory account. This is something for a multi-tenant Azure Active Directory account. This is something that's not available for a normal user flow. So I had to create a custom policy to do it. So I'm kind of covering kind of an overview on what I had to do to implement that. So of course I went to Identity Experience Framework. I download the starter pack and I customized the policies. And if you go to the GitHub and you go to this directory, you can actually get those policies. To edit the policies, I like to use Visual Studio Code. It just has a nice XML editor. So if you were to go to GitHub and grab mine, basically wherever I have your B2C domain, you can just put in your B2C domain, and you can then actually run the app, and it would actually work for you. So if we look at the extensions file there, it's a pretty big thing, and there's a lot to it. There are a lot of directions on, how it's configured and that sort of thing. But if you look in there, you'll see things like Twitter OAuth, because I allow you to log in through Twitter. And you'll see how, okay, this Twitter section points to another section, and this is where all the customization is done. So if you do actually want to use this on your own, and again, in the links at the end of this, I'll have the blog post that actually walks you through a lot of these steps. There will be links to say you have to set up Azure Active Directory tenant using this link. You set up Google using this link, Twitter using this link, and Microsoft accounts using this link. Ones that you don't want, you can actually just remove those sections from the custom policy, and then they won't be there. And then, like I said, the final thing is that to trigger this policy, you would then put in the name of the policy ID. And when a person clicks on it, it would use that policy rather than, say, the default user flow. Okay, so, and actually, if I can just quickly show you what that looks like. And Blazor Simple Survey, yes. So this is actually the application. So if you click Login, you'll see that I have all these various logins. So if I click in using Twitter, it redirects me to Twitter, logs me in. And quickly see up here, you see the name of the sign up, sign in policy, and I'm logged in. This account happens to be an administration account, so I can actually go into administration. this is looking at all my Azure B2C tenants, and I can even do a search, and if I go in here, it can detect what groups I'm in. I can click a button to add users to groups. I can update their name and that sort of thing. And I can even see logs of when people log in. So how this kind of works, that's what I'm going to show you next. So go ahead and do that. And back to current slide. Okay, so logging a user into, now we're going back to Blazor Server. So person's logged in. So how do we store their their information in our local database so that the application can know who the user is and interact with the user at that level? So for the application I just showed you, there's a users table and there's also a logs table. So in the startup file, we've added the following code to the configure services section. And actually, I think I've updated this to .NET 6, so it's not in the startup file anymore. It's in the program.cs file. So we have code like this. And what happens is that we're saying we're starting the authentication, get the configuration from the Azure AD B2C section. So if you remember in the app settings file, the section was Azure AD B2C. So that gets me all the settings there. When the person clicks the login button, this piece of code runs. So you can actually customize what happens here, but in this case I don't. So I just have this task yield, which sends them on to Azure B2C. If they don't authenticate, this section would run. So again, you can log something in the database here, and then of course you always want to have a yield at the end there. So now though, when the person does successfully log in, this on ticket receive section runs. So at this point, it returns this value here, and you can then grab all the auth claims here. So this is where I'm able to know what their identity provider is, what their object identifier is. This is what I use as the primary key to identify the person. I can also get their email address, their first name, their last name, the flow that was used to trigger them. And of course, you have auth times, you have their display name. And in this case, I also get an IDP access token. And if this is here, I know that they're logging in through Azure AD multi-tenant. So this is configured. The fact that this is being returned was configured in the custom flow that I created. And then it then goes to this code that says, well, if the identity provider says they're Google, that means they're Google. Otherwise, they're Microsoft or they're Twitter. If, however, there is an IDP access token, that's how I know that they're Azure Active Directory multi-tenant. And then I have this extra code here, which then gets that token and then pulls out their email address based upon the UPN, which is in that access token. At this point, I have all the information I want, and I can start inserting their information into the database. So if they're a new user, basically, I create a new object, set all these values, and then call save changes. If they're an existing user, logging in, then I'll then update all their information and then call save changes. So that just shows you how you can, when a person's logging in, you can programmatically, have code that will run, gather information, update your database to do whatever you want. But now we want to manage the users. If we go into the Azure B2C tenant and we click on the users tab, Any person who's signed in will show up in this tenant. We can actually click on a person and we can see their information, but this is in the Azure B2C tenant. It's not inside our application. Well, what if we want to have management, which is some people are administrators, some people are not, some people are in some special group, some people are not. How do we set that up? So to programmatically talk to the Azure B2C tenant from our Blazor application, we need to create yet another app registration. But this time, this app registration will have these special permissions, essentially the ability to read and write to the directory and to read all the person's, the user's properties. And we'll create a new section, an additional section in the Azure, in the app settings.json file called Azure AD B2C management with all those values. And notice we have to create a client secret because whenever you're using certain permissions, advanced permissions, you have to have a client secret. Now we're in the Azure B2C tenant, but there's an Azure Active Directory link in that tenant. And if we click there, we'll actually see groups. So Azure B2C actually doesn't have groups, but the Azure Active Directory section of the Azure B2C tenant, it does have groups. So we can go to groups and we can click the new group button and we can create a group. So I created a group called Simple Survey Administrators. I can just create the group. Now I can add existing members to that group. So my Twitter login, I went ahead and added that account to the administration group. So now when I log in with that Twitter account, Twitter account, I want to detect that user is in the administration group. So how do I do that? One thing real quick here is if I go back to here, yes. In the settings, I said the administration group will be Simple Survey Administrators. So I'm going to show you code that says, I'm looking for if the person in the administration group that was specified by the app settings. Okay. So again, when I log in with that Twitter account, I want the administration group link to show. Otherwise, the person should not see that. So this communication will be using the Microsoft Graph. So I'll add the NuGet packages that I need. I'll also add some helper classes, and this is just code to allow me to talk to the Microsoft Graph, and it's like just helper classes so that I can write less code. Again, to get to this code, you go to the Blazor Simple Survey GitHub, and it's all there, and I'll have links to that at the end of this presentation. So nav menu is where those links on the left-hand side are. So I'll go ahead and open that up. I'll add some using statements. I'll also add some global properties. And then I have this code here. So it looks like a lot, but it's actually not. So first it gets the administration group by looking in that app settings file to, basically get the Simple Surveys administrators. We then create an iConfidential client application, passing in all the settings that we put in the app settings file. And so now we have a confidential client application. So this is going to allow us to communicate through the Microsoft Graph. So we're going to then get a token. We're going to create a new HTTP client so we can make the call. Here we're using some of that helper code. Now we're going to first say who is the person who's logged in. So this code here allows me to see who is logged in. And now I need the person's GUID, that's in Azure Active Directory, Azure Active Directory B2C. So to get that user ID, I then basically make this call for their named identifier. So that's going to give me the GUID of that person. So if it's not null here, I'll then make a call to the graph to basically say, get me all the groups that that person's in and pass it to a method called display groups. So this right here is the display groups method. So the result comes in here, and I just simply get a list of all the groups. And if I have the administration group set, I basically look through all the groups to see if one of them is the administration group. And if it is, then I set is admin to be true. Then the link basically says, and this is in the markup, if the person is an admin, display the administration link. And actually later on I added some more links so it displays the administration section. And that's how it works. Okay. Quick look and see what that looks like. So when I click login, and this time I'm going to log in with my Twitter account because that one's an administrator. Then this code runs. It's the code I showed you. So it makes a call to the Azure Graph. Oh, actually, first it determines what the user ID is. And as you see, that's a GUID. It then makes a call to get all the groups, passes it to the display groups method. This will pull all the groups in. In this case, it's only one group, but it happens to be simple survey administrators, which happens to be the administration group I'm looking for. So therefore, the next piece of code, so it basically says, do I have administration group set? If so, see if the person is in that group. And if they are, is admin will be true. And if is admin is true, then the administration section will then display. Next is the administration page. So I kind of quickly showed you how I was able to see all the users that are in the Azure B2C tenant. Now, when people log in, they are in the database, and I could have shown them directly from the database. However, I want to show how I can programmatically look live into the Azure B2C tenant to get the users there. Because actually there can be some users in the Azure B2C tenant who didn't log in through this particular application. They could have logged into another application, yet they'll still be in the Azure B2C tenant. So we go to the open up the administration Razor page. Basically, the code looks pretty much like the code I've been showing you before. However, this time the call is just basically saying, give me all the users. Also have another call, which says, okay, give me all the users. However, I have a question mark here, and it says, I only want the users where their display name starts with, or their surname starts with, or their given name starts with. So this is what allows the searching to work that I also showed. So I've got this is just the markup where I've got a grid that allows you to display the final list, and also like an edit button and all that sort of thing. And let's go ahead and take a quick look at that. So when I click the administration page, it then calls this method to get all the users. Now, this will only display the first 100 users. So if you have more users than that, then you need to have a paging button, and you can go, pull up 100 users at a time. However, if you're doing a search, then a different piece of code is triggered, which has this method here. And so now it's looking for users that have ADEF web in their name. So now when display users is called, it only returns one user, and that user happens to be ADEF web server Twitter, because ADEF was in the search. and therefore that's the only one that displays. Now, how do you edit a user? So we have an edit user control, and it will display the person who's selected, and you can then make changes to that, and you can either save or even delete the user. So the control simply takes a graph user object that's passed from the administration page that lists all the users that we showed before, and it has some markup to display the first name, last name, and then also a save button and a delete button. So if a person clicks the save button, they're going to update the user. So updating a user is actually pretty straightforward. It's just pretty much a Microsoft Graph thing. Whereas you create a new user object, you only set the values that you want to be updated. So any values that are not here will not be updated. You then, using the Graph client helper code, you pass in that user's GUID, and then you call update, and then the update is basically passing that, and then just does an update. For delete, I actually have a box that pops up for confirmation. So the confirmation box says that if you say yes, you actually want to delete the user. So then it calls it this thing here. In this case, these graph client users pass in that user's object identifier or their GUID, and then you just call delete. It's that simple. Look at that. So in the administration, you can list all the users there or search for a user. When I click the edit button, it takes me to the edit control. Here, you can just set the values, click save. It's then passed to this method here, which simply has a new user object that only has the values that we want to update, and then calls update, and it's updated not just in our database. Actually, it's not updated in our database at all. It's updated on the in the Microsoft Graph. Again, delete works pretty much the same way. However, I didn't show that because it would have deleted the actual user. Now, as a final example, how do you add a person or remove a person from the user groups? So for the simple survey administrators, you saw how inside the Azure B2C tenant, I just manually added the person. But how do you do that programmatically from our Blazor app? So again, we have this section here. If the person is in administration, in the administration group, it shows it, and you can click a button to remove them. And if they're not in the group, you can click a button to add them. So how does that work? So first, we have to get the GUID of that group. So we don't work by name, we work by GUID. So I have this code, which first searches through the groups for starts with that group name. That brings back a collection. Then I searched through that collection for the specific name of the group, and that's how I get the group ID. Now you may say, how come I just didn't do this in one step? I tried that, and for some reason, I have to do 2 steps in order to get the group, because if I try to just get the group where instead of using starts with, I said where the name equals this, it wasn't working for me. So the sample code I have has worked every time, and I've been basically doing it in 2 steps here. Once I have that group ID, to add a person, I just simply call this code where I pass in the person's object identifier. That gets me the user as selected user. Then I create a new directory object where I just put, where the only thing I need in that directory object is that person's ID. And then to put them in the group, I pass in that group ID. I pass in the directory object, which represents the user. I basically call add async, and that puts them in the group. To remove a person from the group, You just pass in that group ID, that person's user ID, and you said delete, and that deletes them. Look and see what that looks like. So if we select a person, if they're not in the administration group, they're not there, we click add. So we get the selected user. We create a directory object that just has that user's ID, and then we pass that user to that group, and now they're in the group. So now when we go back, we see the person is in the group. To remove them, we click the remove button, and that just simply calls the simple code that we have the group ID, we have the person's object identifier ID, and it calls delete, and that removes them from the group. So now when we go back, we see the person's no longer in that administration group. Okay, everything that I've covered here is on my website, blazorhelpwebsite.com. When you go there, there's a section where you can just look at a single section. And if you select Azure B2C, you'll see a number of slides, a number of blog posts. So I think there's actually a total of 5 or 6 now that comprise this entire presentation. So you can get the details of everything I've covered, as well as links to download all the sample code that I've covered. So again, everything is on blazorhelpwebsite.com. And that's all. So thank you so much for joining. And I will stop sharing there. And there you are. So again, thank you so much for coming. And I'll see you at the next event. Thank you.